I used to think love was something you said out loud, something you could hold between your hands like a promise. But over time, I learned it's quieter than that. It's in the things you give up and never get back. My name is Helen Carter, and for 10 years, my life stopped the day my father fell. It was a Thursday, November maybe. I remember, because the sky looked like metal that afternoon, and the air smelled of frozen leaves. He was out on the back porch trying to hang a light bulb. I told him to wait for me, that I'd do it when I got off work. He didn't listen. He never did. By the time I got home, the neighbor's boy was standing in the driveway, yelling my name. Dad was on the ground, his hip shattered, his pride worse. That's how it began. Not with a decision, but a fall. And just like that, I became the daughter who stayed. The hospital kept him for 3 weeks. I visited every day, sat by his bed while he complained about the food and the nurses and the way the light hit the curtains. I told him he'd be fine. He said, "Don't tell me that. I'm not a fool." That was my father, proud even when broken. When they finally let him come home, I packed my bags. I quit my job at the library, gave up my tiny apartment, and moved back into the house I grew up in. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, faded wallpaper, the same creaky floor that had complained since I was 5. But to him, it was the only place that mattered. To me, it was the beginning of something I didn't yet have the courage to call the end. The first few months, I told myself it was temporary. He'd heal, get stronger, maybe walk again. He didn't. The injury became infection. The infection became exhaustion. And the exhaustion became a daily ritual of pills, appointments, and endless waiting. Mornings started at 6. I'd help him out of bed, make oatmeal, set the pills beside his glass of water. He'd grumble about the temperature or the texture or the news. Every task was a battle, every word a test, but I did it every day, because that's what good daughters do, or so I thought. My brother David called once a week. Always the same words. How's Dad doing? Never, how are you, Helen? He'd talk about his job, his kids, his business trips, all those shiny pieces of a life I once thought I'd have too. He'd say things like, "You're doing great, sis. He's lucky to have you." And I'd say, "Yeah, lucky." Then I'd hang up, look at my hands, cracked, tired, covered in the faint smell of antiseptic, and wonder if luck was just another word for being left behind. And by the end of that first year, I'd stopped counting the days. The house became a machine. Every movement rehearsed, every sound predictable. The scrape of his walker, the click of pill bottles, the kettle's whistle at precisely 7:10 a.m. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at the wall clock, watching the second hand tremble as it moved. It was the only thing in the house that still went forward. Neighbors came by now and then. Mrs. Parker from across the street would bring casseroles and say, "You're such a saint, Helen." I'd smile, thank her, and throw them out the next day, because I wasn't a saint. I was a woman who hadn't slept through a night in months. A woman who dreamed of silence and hated herself for wanting it. Dad had his good days. He'd ask me to read to him, the newspaper mostly. He liked hearing about people worse off than we were. Politics, scandals, wars. He'd shake his head and say, "People are fools, always have been." Then he'd look at me and add, "You're too soft, Helen. That's your problem." I used to argue. I don't anymore. After a while, you stop defending yourself when you realize the person judging you has already decided who you are. Winter came hard that second year. The pipes froze, the car broke down, and Dad's mood turned meaner with the cold. He'd snap at me over small things, how I folded his shirts, how I stirred his soup, how I breathed too loud when I thought he was asleep. Once I caught him staring at me with this strange, distant look. Not anger, not love, something in between, like he couldn't remember if I was his daughter or just another person who owed him something. That night, after he went to bed, I stood by the window for a long time. Outside, snow fell in slow, soundless flakes. The streetlight made them glow like ash. I thought about what it meant to be trapped in a house that no longer felt like home. Then I turned off the light and told myself this was what devotion looked like. By year 3, the lines on his face had deepened. Mine too. He refused most visitors, said people tired him out. The truth was, he didn't want them to see how small he'd become. And I didn't want them to see how small I'd become taking care of him. There's something no one tells you about caretaking. It doesn't just drain your time, it eats your shape. You start to shrink, fold inward, disappear behind the person you're saving, until one day you look in the mirror and realize you've turned into the wallpaper, still there, but unseen. Sometimes I'd find old photos of us from before the fall, Dad with his arm around me at the fair, me laughing, hair windblown, eyes bright. He used to tell people I was his favorite. But favorites fade when time asks for more than love can give. One evening, I made soup for dinner. He took a sip, set the spoon down, and said, "Too salty. You used to know how to cook." I wanted to say I used to know how to live too, but I didn't. I just cleaned the bowl and went to bed early. The silence between us had become its own kind of language. Tatiana. In spring, David visited for the first time in over a year. He brought flowers, lilies, his wife's idea. He hugged Dad like a guest greeting the host of a show. And when Dad asked about his job, David talked for 20 minutes straight. About clients, investments, new houses, new cars. He didn't look at me once. And when he left, he handed me a gift card and said, "Get yourself something nice." I almost laughed, because what could I possibly buy that would feel like freedom? Fama. That night, after the dishes were done and Dad was asleep, I sat in the dark living room. The clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed, the world outside went on living. And for the first time, I whispered out loud, "What if this is all I'll ever be?" No one answered, just the soft groan of old wood under my feet. The sound of a house that, like me, had forgotten what it was built for. Year 4 felt like an echo that never stopped. The same days repeating themselves, only slightly quieter each time. I'd wake, make breakfast, give him his medication, tidy up and watch the light crawl across the living room wall until it disappeared again. That's what caretaking does. It turns time into something you survive, not something you live. Tantoyo. My father had started keeping the blinds shut. He said sunlight made the dust show, and the dust made him feel old. I think he just didn't want to see the world moving on without him. Sometimes I'd open a window just to feel the air. He'd snap, "You'll let the cold in, Helen." So I'd close it again. Little by little, I stopped touching things that weren't mine. Stopped deciding what music played, or when the kettle boiled, or how bright the lights should be, because the house had become his kingdom, and I was just a quiet servant keeping the walls from falling. People used to ask me why I never got married. I'd tell them life had other plans. But the truth was simpler. I'd spent too long taking care of one man to ever believe another would be worth the cost. One morning in February, I found him sitting by the radio, not listening, just staring at it. The soft static filled the room like snow. I asked, "You want me to change the station?" He said, "Leave it. It's better than conversation." I don't know why that hurt so much. Maybe because he was right. We hadn't really talked in years. We just traded instructions and obedience, like a script no one believed in anymore. By summer, his legs had weakened more. The doctor said he'd need physical therapy, but he refused to leave the house. He said hospitals were where people went to die. I wanted to tell him, "So is this house, Dad," but I didn't. I kept my mouth shut, my voice steady, and my hands working, always working. He depended on me for everything: food, medication, bills, laundry, his endless list of small complaints. And yet somehow he never saw what it cost. He thought the world still owed him something, and I was just there to deliver it. One night he called out for me. I ran to his room, half asleep, heart pounding. He just pointed to his blanket. It had slipped an inch off his shoulder. When I fixed it, he muttered, "Took you long enough." Then he turned over and slept again. I stood there for a long time in the dark, watching him breathe. My chest hurt, not from anger, not even sadness, just from the realization that my love had turned into labor, and labor without gratitude is slavery. David called again that week. He said he was thinking of taking Dad's old tools. For sentimental reasons. I told him they were still in the garage. He said, "Great, I'll swing by Henna next month." He didn't. He never did. That's the thing about people like David. They always find a way to make distance look like duty. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when the phone rang. It was Linda, my old friend from the library. She said they were hiring part-time help. Her voice was warm, like sunlight through a window I hadn't opened in years. But before I could answer, Dad shouted from his room, "Helen, I need you here." And I knew the answer without saying it. I hung up and folded the last towel, pressing each edge straight like a punishment. I never called her back. By year 5, I stopped expecting visitors. The world forgets you when your life becomes someone else's routine. Birthdays passed quietly. Christmas came and went. David sent cards, typed, not handwritten, with the same message every year. "Hope you're both doing well." I'd read it once, tear it in half, and throw it away. Because we weren't doing well. We were surviving on borrowed time, and I was the one paying the interest. One night, the power went out during a storm. The house was pitch black, except for the dim glow of lightning through the curtains. Dad shouted for me. "Where are you?" I said. "Right here." He said, "You're always right there, aren't you?" Something in his tone made me stop breathing for a second. Not cruel, not kind, just true. Because I was always right there, invisible, constant, necessary. When the lights came back on, he was asleep, and I sat in the chair beside his bed, staring at my reflection in the window. The storm had passed, but the sound of it stayed inside me. By the 7th year, the house had started to rot. Water stains on the ceiling, cracks on the walls. The kind of decay that mirrors the people living inside. I asked David if he could help pay for repairs. He said, maybe next quarter, when things are better at work. Things were never better at work. Not for him, not for me. Sometimes I'd imagine what he told his friends. Probably that his sister was a saint, devoted, selfless, brave. People love stories like that. They make neglect look noble. Dad's memory began to slip around then. He'd call me Margaret, my mother's name. At first I corrected him. Then I stopped. It was easier to be someone he loved than someone he blamed. Once he looked at me and said, "You've grown bitter, Margaret." I smiled and said, "I learned from the best." He didn't understand. Maybe that was a mercy. That winter, I got sick. Fever, cough, the kind that lingers. I stayed in bed one morning, too weak to stand. By noon, he was banging his cane on the floor, yelling for breakfast. When I didn't answer fast enough, he dragged himself to my room, stood in the doorway, and said, "You can't take one day off? Not one." I turned my face to the wall and said nothing. He walked away, muttering about how ungrateful people get when you give them too much. I laughed, quietly, bitterly, because he had no idea how right he was. That night, I dreamed of my old life, the library, the smell of paper, the sound of people whispering in aisles. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I woke up crying, and for once, I didn't wipe the tears away. The next morning, I looked out the window at the garden. The roses I'd planted years ago had all died, strangled by weeds. I thought about pulling them out, but I didn't. Because it felt right, somehow, that something once beautiful had withered from neglect. It was honest, and honesty had become the only thing I had left. That was the year I stopped hoping he'd change, stopped waiting for gratitude, for softness, for the father I remembered from childhood, the man who carried me on his shoulders, who fixed my bike, who laughed when I spilled lemonade on his shoes. That man was gone, and the one who replaced him was just a ghost wearing his face. By year 8, I no longer thought of myself as a person. I was an extension of the house, a pair of hands that fed, washed, and cleaned, but didn't belong to anyone. When I spoke, my voice startled me. It sounded smaller than I remembered, like it was afraid to fill the room. Dad's health continued its slow downhill slide. The doctor called it manageable decline. I called it a countdown. Every morning at 6, I'd hear him tap his cane against the floor. Once, twice, pause, my signal to get up. There were no alarms anymore. His rhythm was mine. I'd walk into his room and say good morning. He'd answer without looking at me. "You took long enough." That was his way of saying he was still alive. I stopped taking pictures of anything, stopped writing in my journal, stopped counting birthdays. When you live in service of someone else's life, you forget your own has a pulse. And c'est tout. David came back for the first time in 3 years. He stood in the doorway like a guest checking into a museum. "Wow, Helen," he said, "you've really kept the place up." I looked around at the peeling paint, the smell of medicine, and laughed, quietly, so he wouldn't hear. He brought Dad a bottle of wine he couldn't drink and a new sweater he'd never wear. Then he talked about his kids, his promotion, his plans for a vacation in Italy. Dad listened with eyes bright and alive in a way they hadn't been for months. He laughed, and for a second I hated them both for it. When David left, Dad watched his car disappear down the driveway and said, "He's done well for himself." I said, "He had the time to." He didn't answer. That night I washed the dishes twice, once for him, once for the part of me that still believed he might someday notice. By year 9, my hands shook constantly. The doctor said it was stress. He prescribed rest. I laughed until I cried in the parking lot. Rest isn't something you take. It's something you're given. And no one was giving me anything. That evening, I burned the soup. The smell filled the kitchen, sharp and bitter. Dad yelled from his chair, "You can't do anything right anymore." I stared at him. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't apologize. I just stood there, the spoon in my hand still dripping. He looked away first, and in that small moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer his caretaker. I was his shadow, learning how to disappear without permission. That night, I went to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize my own face. The skin was gray, the eyes dull. Lines had formed around my mouth from years of biting back words. I touched the glass and whispered, "You used to be someone." The mirror fogged over from my breath. When it cleared, I was still there, and somehow less. In spring, a storm hit hard. Thunder rolled through the valley, and the power went out. Dad called for me again and again. I sat in the hallway listening, not moving. Lightning flashed, lighting his doorway for a second, and I saw him sitting there, small, afraid. Something in me softened. I walked in and put a blanket over his shoulders. He didn't look at me, just whispered, "You won't leave, will you?" I said, "No." But what I meant was, I already have. A few months later, I found a draft letter in his desk drawer. It was addressed to David. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "You should take care of the estate. Helen doesn't understand these things." I read it 3 times, then I put it back. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt like a heartbeat I didn't want to hear. On his 91st birthday, he asked me to sit with him in the garden. It was rare for him to go outside anymore. We sat in silence for a long time until he said, "I know you think I've been hard on you." "I don't think, Dad. I know. You got your mother's temper." "And you got her grace," I said. He smiled, just barely, and then said, "I always wanted more for you, but you never left." I wanted to scream that I couldn't, that he had tied my life to his like an anchor, but I just said, "Someone had to stay." He nodded like that explained everything. It didn't. Winter returned. He fell again one morning while trying to reach for his cane. This time he didn't curse. He just looked at me from the floor and said, "You're still here." I called the doctor, cleaned his wound, and sat beside his bed for hours after he fell asleep. I remember thinking, maybe that's what love really is, staying long enough to resent it. That night, I didn't dream. I just lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks I'd memorized over the years. The house creaked with age, echoing every groan like a confession. I thought about David, about the life he was living somewhere bright and busy. And for the first time, I didn't feel jealous. I felt nothing. When morning came, I stood by the window, watching the sunlight crawl across the floor. Dad was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Outside, the world was moving again. I pressed my hand to the cold glass and whispered I had become what he needed, not who I was. And for the first time in 10 years, I let that truth hurt. My father died on a Sunday. The house was quiet that morning, unnaturally so. The clock in the hallway had stopped ticking. The air smelled of dust and medicine. When I went to check on him, he wasn't breathing. He looked peaceful in a way he hadn't in years. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat down beside him and stared at the window until the light changed. After 10 years of noise, his voice, his cough, his commands, the silence felt like something too large to fit inside my chest. The doctor came, then the coroner. They asked questions I answered by rote. Yes, I was his caretaker. Yes, he'd been declining. No, there were no other relatives in the house. The coroner's pen scratched against the form. Natural causes, he wrote. I wondered if exhaustion counted as natural. When they carried the body out, I followed behind barefoot. The porch boards were cold under my feet. For the first time in a decade, I stood in the doorway and didn't know what to do. A neighbor came running, Mrs. Parker again. Her face twisted into that soft pity people wear when they're grateful it didn't happen to them. She hugged me too tight and said, "You were such a good daughter, Helen." He couldn't have asked for more. I wanted to tell her he'd asked for everything, and I'd given it, but I just nodded because arguing with kindness is exhausting. That night, I made tea. I didn't drink. The kettle whistled long after I'd turned off the stove. I couldn't stand the sound of quiet, so I turned on the radio, static. The same soft hum he used to listen to when he didn't want to talk. I sat in the dark, the radio whispering nonsense, and waited for something, a feeling, a thought, a tear, but nothing came, just stillness, and the faint realization that I had no idea who I was without him. David arrived the next morning. He walked in like he still owned the air. Same perfect suit, same easy smile. He hugged me briefly, perfunctory. I came as soon as I heard. He didn't. The hospital had called him last night. It was nearly noon now. He looked around the living room, wrinkled his nose. "It smells old in here." "It's been old for a while," I said. He ignored that and asked, "Did you call the lawyer?" The lawyer, not the funeral home, not a priest, the lawyer. That was my brother, always beginning where the money was. We buried my father 3 days later. The church was half empty. A few old neighbors, some distant cousins who came for the spectacle of grief. David gave a speech that sounded rehearsed, a list of virtues he'd never witnessed, spoken in the calm tone of a man giving a sales pitch. When it was my turn, I said nothing. I just looked at the coffin and thought, this is the quiet he always wanted. After the service, David took me aside. He put a hand on my shoulder, the kind of gesture you'd give to someone you were trying to look sympathetic toward. We should get the estate sorted soon, he said. I blinked. The estate? Yeah, the house, accounts, paperwork. He said everything was in order. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I saw my father's face in his, that same calm certainty, that same belief that everything he wanted belonged to him already. Ekatin Saudia. That evening I found the envelope on the kitchen table, cream-colored, sealed with the lawyer's stamp. My name written neatly on the corner, Helen Carter. I didn't open it. I couldn't. It felt like a verdict, and I wasn't ready for sentencing. I carried it with me all night, tucked between my fingers, as if it might change its contents if I just held it long enough. It didn't. When I finally broke the seal, the words were simple, final, cruel in their calm. I, Richard Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my assets, property, and savings to my son, David Carter. That was it. No mention of me, not even a thank you. I read it again, hoping maybe I'd missed a page. Maybe there was a note somewhere, something private, just for me. But there wasn't. It was complete in its erasure. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn. The letter beside the teacup, the ink of his signature burned into my memory. 10 years of feeding, bathing, managing, sacrificing. 10 years of being his nurse, maid, accountant, daughter. And this was my inheritance. A handful of words that proved I'd never really existed in his eyes. When David came the next day, he was holding coffee and optimism. Don't take it personally, Helen. Dad just wanted things to be simple. Simple? You know how he was about property. He wanted it in one name. It's easier for taxes. 10 years, I said. What? 10 years of my life, David. He sighed, put his cup down, and said, You always make things harder than they have to be. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that startled us both. I made things harder? You mean staying alive for him was easy for you? He looked away. There was a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Then he said softly, He loved you, you know. And that was the worst part, because I believed him. Later that week, the lawyer called. Formal tone, condolences rehearsed. He asked if I wanted a copy of the will. I said, I already have the scars. He didn't laugh. Lawyers rarely do. He mentioned something about the estate transfer, the need for signatures, the timing of the probate. I said yes to everything because there was no fight left in me. You can't fight a ghost, and you can't reason with the dead. Auntie, that night I went through the house one room at a time. Not to pack, not yet, just to remember. Every chair, every picture, every scar on the floorboard had a story. And every story ended the same way, with me doing the work and him taking the credit. In the living room, I found his glasses on the table, still smudged from the last day he wore them. I picked them up, turned them over in my hand, and thought how strange it was, to miss a man I'd resented for so long. The next morning, David came with a folder. "We'll need to finalize some things," he said. Some things meant everything. The bank, the car, the insurance, the deed. I watched him move through the house with confidence, like a man collecting his birthright. He paused in the doorway of my old room, the one I'd turned into a space for myself in the rare hours I had alone. "You'll want to start packing soon," he said. I stared at him. He said it softly, almost kindly, but the meaning was the same. "You don't belong here anymore." I wanted to tell him the house still smelled like me, the soap, the meals, the sweat, the grief, but he wouldn't have understood. Some people can't smell sacrifice until it burns. That night, I dreamed I was back in the hospital, not as a patient, but as him, hooked to machines, watching the world go on without me. When I woke, I couldn't breathe. The walls felt closer than ever. The house, my cage, my confessional, now belonged to someone who'd never cleaned its floors. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. Then I whispered, "You finally took everything, didn't you?" And for the first time, I realized I wasn't talking to my father anymore. I was talking to the version of myself that had died taking care of him. The will reading was on a Tuesday. The sky was gray, not stormy, not bright, just gray. Like the world couldn't decide whether to mourn or move on. The law office was downtown, the kind of place that smelled like dust and carpet cleaner. The receptionist smiled the way people do when they've practiced sympathy. "Mr. and Ms. Carter," David answered for both of us. He always did. We sat in a small conference room with no windows. The walls were lined with framed diplomas and shelves full of books no one had opened in years. I sat on one side of the table, David on the other. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, shuffled papers and cleared his throat like an actor rehearsing grief. "Your father's wishes were very clear," he began. I almost laughed. Of course they were. Mr. Thompson went through the document slowly. The property deed, the savings account, the small life insurance policy. Every item, every dollar, every memory, all signed over to David. He paused once, maybe out of pity, maybe to give me time to breathe, but I didn't need time. You can't suffocate twice on the same truth. When he finished, he folded his hands and said, "There was a note at the end. It's not legally binding, but perhaps meaningful." He turned the page. His eyes flicked toward me briefly before he read aloud. "To my daughter Helen, thank you for everything you've done. You'll understand someday why I made this choice." Understand. That word hit harder than any inheritance could have. Because it meant he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it anyway. "Tais-toi." David broke the silence first. "Dad always said I should handle things. You know how he was about responsibility." I looked at him and said quietly, "Responsibility? He couldn't even handle his own pills." He frowned. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "it isn't." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat again. "Perhaps this isn't the place." "It's fine," I said. Because I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is hot. Mine was cold, dense, the kind that sinks to the bottom and never melts. After the meeting, we walked outside. David looked relieved, like a man finishing a chore. He said, "You can stay here for a bit, Helen. I'll give you time to figure things out." Time, I repeated. As long as you need, within reason, of course. Within reason. He said it kindly, as if compassion were a favor he could schedule. I looked up at the sky, the same dull gray, and realized it matched the color of the life I'd been given. That night, I went back to the house. My house, his house, no one's house. The place felt different, like it was already deciding who to belong to next. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the silence pressing against me like fog. On the coffee table, I placed the copy of the will. I read it again, slowly, word by word. Then I laughed, a small, quiet sound that startled even me. Because it hit me then, he'd managed to control me even from the grave. I'd spent 10 years being his caretaker, and now I was his ghost. The next morning, I found David in the kitchen. He was going through drawers, taking measurements, checking labels on paint cans. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Just looking at some renovation options," he said, too casually. "This place could use an update." Renovation. The word sliced clean through me. I stood there, watching him handle everything I'd preserved: the chipped teacup, the crooked shelf, the burn mark on the counter where Dad used to rest his cigarettes. To me, they were years. To him, they were clutter. "You could have waited a week," I said. "I'm just planning ahead." "Planning ahead," I repeated. "You always were good at that." He looked up, sensing the weight behind my words, but said nothing. Later, I found myself in my father's room. The bed was neatly made, David's doing, not mine. He'd packed away most of the personal things, the photos, the letters, the old army medals. But on the dresser, one frame remained. It was a picture of the three of us, me, Dad, and David, taken decades ago at a summer fair. We were smiling, the sunlight caught in Dad's hair, making it look gold. I remember that day, how Dad had spent all morning teaching David to throw a baseball. When I tried, he said, "You're too delicate for this, Helen." So I held the camera instead. It was the first time I learned how easy it was to vanish from the picture. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing my father's voice, not real words, just the tone, commanding, dismissive, familiar. And underneath it, David's, calm, rational, entitled. The same voice, just younger. It felt like the house was full of ghosts, and I was the only living thing left inside it. At 3 a.m., I got up and started cleaning, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I scrubbed the counters, washed the floors, polished the silver until it shone. By morning, the house looked perfect, and I hated it for that. David came by again with a real estate agent, a tall woman with bright lipstick and heels that clicked like accusations. She smiled politely. "Beautiful home, good bones, just needs a little fresh air." I wanted to tell her the air was full of ghosts, but I stayed quiet. She asked how long I'd be transitioning out. David said a few weeks, maybe a month. He didn't even look at me. He didn't need to. He already knew I wouldn't fight. That's the thing about people who've taken everything from you. They stop seeing you as someone who might still have claws. Sitatu. That evening, I sat on the porch steps, the letter folded in my hand again. The street was empty, the air heavy with the smell of rain. I thought about leaving, about packing a bag, taking a bus, starting over somewhere no one knew my name. But I couldn't move. 10 years of staying had turned into a habit my bones didn't know how to break. I whispered into the night, "You win, Dad." Then softer, "You always do." The rain came hard after that, soaking the ground until the garden turned to mud. The roses were gone, the weeds had swallowed them whole. I stood at the window, watching them drown, and I realized that was the perfect metaphor for us, roots too deep to save anything still alive. That night, I burned the copy of the will. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it to see if I could feel anything watching it disappear. But even as the paper curled and blackened, I felt nothing. Just the faint warmth on my face, the closest thing to affection I'd felt in years. The day I finally spoke to David again was the day the realtor hung the for sale sign out front. It was red and white, sharp against the dying grass. I stood at the window, watching it sway in the wind, and something inside me, something that had been quiet for years, finally moved. David was in the kitchen, going through papers. His voice carried easily through the house. "We've got 2 offers already. People love the layout." He sounded happy, that clean, effortless kind of happiness that comes when you get exactly what you want, without having to bleed for it. I walked in. He didn't look up. "You should start packing, Helen. I'll help you find a place. Maybe near town?" I said nothing, just stood there, hands folded, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup. It smelled like money and arrogance. Finally, I said, "Do you ever think about him?" He looked up, confused. "Dad?" "Yes, him. Of course, he was complicated." Complicated. That was David's favorite word, a neat little box to fit all the things he didn't want to understand. "You think he loved you?" I asked. He frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." "He loved both of us, Helen, in his own way." His own way. I let the words hang there, heavy and bitter. His way was cruelty dressed as duty. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You're still angry." "No," I said softly. "I'm awake." He leaned against the counter. "You know, he worried about you. He told me once you'd never make it on your own." "He was right," I said. "He made sure of it." He blinked, unsure if I was joking. "You can't keep blaming him for everything." "I don't. I blame myself for staying." That shut him up. I walked over to the drawer and opened it. Inside were the last of the house keys, the bills, the faded photographs. I picked up one photo, the 3 of us again, at that summer fair, and held it out to him. "Do you remember this?" He nodded. "You smiled like you meant it," I said. "I did," he said. "I didn't," I whispered. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The house creaked softly in the wind. Dust floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts. "What do you want from me, Helen?" "Nothing." "You're angry, but you won't fight me." "There's nothing to fight for." He exhaled sharply. "You can't just walk away from everything." "Watch me." I started gathering a few things. My father's glasses, a photo of my mother, a single worn blanket. Each item felt lighter than it should. "You're just going to leave," he said. "I already did. I just didn't know it until now." Fetite, When I reached the door, he called out, "You think walking away makes you better than him? Than me?" I turned back. The morning light caught in the dust, framing him like a ghost of privilege. "No, David, it makes me free." He stared, trying to read my face. "What are you going to do?" "Live," I said, "something none of you ever taught me how to do." And with that, I stepped outside. The grass was damp from last night's rain. The for sale sign tilted slightly, its paint already beginning to fade. I reached out and straightened it. It felt symbolic, absurdly so, like setting the final piece of a tombstone upright. The wind moved through the trees, soft and uncertain. For the first time in years, I breathed in without feeling the weight of duty pressing against my ribs. The air was thin, but clean, the kind of air that didn't owe anyone anything. I didn't have a plan, just a small suitcase, a few bills, and a pocket full of silence. I walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. The bench was cold. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless. For a moment, I thought about turning back. Then I remembered his face, my father's, the way he'd looked at me the day I brought him home from the hospital. That quiet expectation, that silent ownership, and I stayed where I was. A bus came, old faded blue paint, engine coughing. I climbed aboard and sat by the window. The driver asked, "Where to, ma'am?" I said, "Anywhere." He nodded as if he'd heard that before. Maybe he had. The road wound past the town I'd lived in all my life. The grocery store, the post office, the church. All of it sliding backward through the glass. It looked smaller than I remembered. I thought about David, about the house, about the letter, about the years I'd lost to someone else's needs. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt weightless, because you can't lose what was never truly yours. In my head, I heard my father's voice one last time. "You'll understand someday," I whispered back. "I do. But understanding isn't forgiveness, it's just clarity. The moment the fog lifts and you realize the pain was never complicated, just cruel." As the bus climbed a hill, the sun broke through the clouds, a brief golden slice of light cutting across the fields. It hit my face through the glass, warm, almost kind. For the first time in years, I closed my eyes and let it touch me. No duty, no guilt, no ghosts, just light. The bus turned west, toward the horizon. I looked out the window, my reflection faint against the fading sky. I whispered to myself, not a prayer, not a goodbye, just the truth. He left the house to David, but he left the silence to me, and silence at last is mine. Fade to black. The first night away from the house, I stayed at a roadside motel. The kind with peeling paint and vending machines that only take quarters. The room smelled faintly of bleach and cigarettes, but to me, it smelled like possibility. I dropped my small suitcase by the bed, sat down and listened. No coughing from the next room, no cane tapping against the floor, no voice calling my name. For the first time in 10 years, silence wasn't a punishment. It was peace. I lay down fully clothed, the hum of the air conditioner filling the room like a lullaby, and I slept. Really slept. Not the kind of shallow rest between alarms and pills, but the kind where your body finally believes it's safe. When I woke, sunlight was spilling through the thin curtains. I made coffee from the tiny packet on the dresser, bitter, lukewarm, perfect. Outside, a few cars passed. A mother scolded her child near the gas station next door. Someone laughed. Ordinary sounds. I hadn't realized how much I missed them. I opened the motel window. A breeze came in, soft and warm. It carried the faint smell of asphalt and wildflowers. And I thought, so this is what the world smells like without duty. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Auntie. There was a diner across the street, Benny's Cafe. I went there for breakfast. The waitress called everyone "hon" and poured coffee before you asked. She looked at me and said, "You look tired, hun. Long drive." I said, "A long 10 years." She laughed, not realizing it wasn't a joke. And that was fine. I watched people come and go, couples arguing softly, kids with syrup on their faces, a man reading the paper like the world hadn't ended for him. It felt strange to be invisible again, but this time it didn't hurt. It felt like safety. I stayed at that motel for 3 weeks. Each day I walked a little farther. At first, just down the road, then into town. The library was small, 1 floor, a few dusty shelves, but I went in anyway. The woman at the desk, Martha, smiled at me. "Looking for something to read?" "Looking for something to do," I said. We talked for a while. When I mentioned I used to work in a library years ago, her eyes lit up. "We could use help. It's not much pay, but—" I said yes before she finished. That night, back at the motel, I wrote the words "I said yes" on a scrap of paper and taped it to the wall. It was the first time I'd said yes to myself in over a decade. The library became my sanctuary. It was quiet, but not heavy. The kind of quiet that hums with purpose, not grief. Children came for story hour. Old men read newspapers by the window. Sometimes people just came in to escape the heat. No one needed me there, and that, oddly, made me useful again. I learned their names slowly. Martha, Jamie, a retired teacher named Paul who brought muffins every Thursday. We talked about books, not life. It was enough. One afternoon, a child asked if I lived alone. I said yes. He frowned. "Isn't that sad?" I smiled and said, "No, it's peaceful." He nodded as if that made sense to him. One morning, I got a letter from David. No envelope, just a printed page folded into thirds. The handwriting wasn't his, typed, clean, distant. "Helen, the house sold last month. I kept a few things for you. Some photos, Dad's old watch. I thought you might want them. I hope you're doing okay. Maybe someday we can talk about everything. David." I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the back of a book on the shelf behind the counter. Not to keep it safe, just to hide it. There was nothing to say. Some people write to ease their guilt, not to reach the person they've hurt. That night, I dreamed I was back in the house, but it wasn't heavy anymore. The windows were open, the curtains moving with the wind. I heard my father's voice, but it wasn't cruel this time. He said, "You did enough." And when I turned, he wasn't there. Just the empty chair by the window. I woke up crying, not from pain, from release. 6 months later, on my birthday, Martha brought cake to the library. 61, she said, lighting a single candle. I laughed. You made me older. I'm 60. Then blow it out quick, she said, before it gets truer. We ate cake between the stacks. Chocolate, too sweet, perfect. And for the first time in years, I didn't wish for anything. That summer, I took a bus to the coast. The ocean smelled like salt and second chances. I walked barefoot along the water until the tide touched my toes. Each wave pulled a little more of the past away. I thought about all those years spent in that house, the endless loop of service, silence, resentment. And I realized I had carried that life like a wound, when all it ever wanted to be was a scar. Scars don't hurt forever. They just remind you of the lessons that finally healed. As the sun set, I sat on the sand and whispered to the sea, "You took everything from me, Dad." The waves answered softly, "No, you gave it." And I smiled, because maybe that was the truth I'd been avoiding all along. We can't control who takes from us, but we can choose when to stop giving. Fade to gold light. By the next spring, I had my own place. A small apartment above a bakery that smelled like sugar and yeast every morning. One room, one window, one bed. Perfect. I painted the walls pale yellow, not because I loved the color, but because it reminded me of sunlight on the kitchen floor of the old house. On the rare mornings, it didn't feel like a prison. There was no furniture at first, just a chair I found by the dumpster and a lamp with a missing shade. I liked it that way. Empty rooms make honest echoes. My days found a rhythm again. I'd wake before sunrise, make coffee on a small stove, watch the street below fill with people who had somewhere to be. Then I'd walk to the library. The world moved differently when I wasn't dragging the weight of someone else's needs. Time didn't hurt anymore. It just passed. I'd read again, slowly, deliberately, like someone relearning a forgotten language. Poetry mostly. Short lines, few words, the kind that say everything by saying almost nothing. My favorite was from Mary Oliver. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The first time I read it, I laughed, because for years my life hadn't felt wild or precious. It had felt like a duty on repeat. But one morning I underlined those words in pencil and whispered to myself, maybe this, maybe starting over. Martha, the librarian, became a quiet friend. We didn't talk about our pasts. We just existed side by side, filling the hours with tasks and small talk. One evening, after closing, she said, "You know, Helen, I used to think peace meant nothing ever happened. And now? Now I think it means the right things finally do." I smiled. "You sound like a poet." "I read too many of them," she said. We laughed, soft, real, and in that moment, I realized laughter could sound different when it wasn't built on exhaustion. Every Saturday, I went to the farmer's market. I didn't buy much, a loaf of bread, sometimes flowers, but I liked walking among people who didn't know my story. No one looked at me with pity. No one remembered the caretaker, the daughter, the ghost. One afternoon, a man selling fruit asked my name. When I told him, he said, "That's an old name. Not many Helens left." "Maybe I'm the last one," I said. "Then make it count," he smiled. It was the first time in years someone had spoken to me like I was still part of the world. That night, I found the letter from David again. I hadn't touched it since the day I hid it in that book. For reasons I can't explain, I read it again, slowly this time. At the bottom, below his name, he had written one new sentence. P.S. There's money from the sale. Your share, if you'll take it. I folded the page and left it on my kitchen table. In the morning, I mailed it back. No note, no words. Just returned, like an unwanted gift. Because freedom paid for by guilt isn't freedom at all. Fikatatia. 6 months after moving, I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't flinch. The wrinkles were still there. The tired eyes, too, but the face was mine again. I'd stopped being invisible, not because the world saw me, but because I did. I stood there for a long time, then whispered, "You came back." It sounded strange, saying that to myself, but it felt right. One afternoon, I was shelving books when someone called my name. I turned, and there he was, David. He looked older, tired in the way money can't fix. He smiled, small, uncertain. Hey, I said. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know you worked here." I didn't either, not until I did. He laughed, awkward. "You look good, Helen." I look like someone who stopped being useful. He nodded, maybe understanding. "I brought the watch," he said, and held it out. "Our father's old silver one, the band worn thin." "I don't want it," I said. "Then take it anyway," he said softly. "For time's sake." I hesitated, then took it. It was heavier than I remembered. He left soon after. No apologies, no forgiveness, just that watch, a clock that no longer belonged to either of us. That night, I sat at my window, turning the watch over in my hands. It ticked faintly, slower than it should. Each second felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I set it on the windowsill and let it run out. When it stopped, I didn't rewind it. Time had served enough masters already. Tilda. Weeks passed. The library grew busier with summer heat. Children filled the aisles again. One day, a little girl with braids asked if I could read her a story. I hesitated, then picked a book at random. Charlotte's Web. Her voice joined mine as I read aloud. When the story ended, she said, "I wish it didn't have to end." I smiled. Some endings are just new beginnings with better lighting. She looked at me like that made perfect sense. My life wasn't grand. It wasn't full of laughter or noise or romance. It was small, gentle, predictable, but it was mine. I didn't own a house. I didn't have anyone waiting for me at home. What I had was a key, a quiet room, and mornings that belonged to me. And sometimes, when the sun hit the walls just right, I thought maybe that was enough. Sunday mornings used to be my worst days. They were his doctor days, his pill days, his moods like weather days. Now they're just quiet. I make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the world wake up slowly. People walk dogs. A couple argues softly near the bakery downstairs. Someone laughs, too loud, too alive. I used to hate that sound. Now it reminds me the world kept moving even when I stopped. And maybe that's how it's supposed to be. I bought a notebook from the dollar store, cheap paper, flimsy cover. But it felt right, unassuming, blank. I didn't know what to write at first. For so long, my life had been a list of things done for others. Lists don't heal you, stories do. So I started small, 1 page a day. No fancy words, no dates, no order. Just fragments of a woman remembering how to exist. I am learning how to eat slow. The sun looked kind today. No one asked me for anything. It wasn't poetry, but it was peace. Ikikito. Martha came by with flowers. You missed 2 days of work, she said, mock serious. I took a vacation, I said. Where to? Here. She smiled, then noticed the notebook. Writing something? Myself, I said. I never got to before. She touched my shoulder, a small, wordless gesture that said, I understand. Sometimes that's all we need. That night, I sat down and wrote the first real letter of my life. Not to my father, not to David, to me. Dear Helen, you spent 10 years giving everything away. Your time, your sleep, your laughter, your dreams. And for what? A ghost's approval? A man's inheritance? No more. You survived what should have broken you. You learned that love without freedom isn't love, it's servitude dressed in duty. You learned that silence can be cruel, but it can also be sacred. You are no longer a caretaker. You are no longer a daughter trapped in memory. You are simply alive, and that is enough. You don't owe forgiveness. You don't owe explanation. You owe yourself tomorrow. With love, the woman who finally came home. I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and tucked it between the pages of my journal. Not to mail, just to keep close, for the days I might forget who I've become. A week later, I went to the park. It was spring again, the kind that makes the air smell like wet grass and second chances. Children played, old couples fed pigeons. A teenager practiced guitar under a tree, his voice cracking but brave. I sat on a bench and just listened. Every sound felt new. Every life around me, a reminder that survival isn't just breathing, it's participation. A woman beside me offered half her sandwich. I smiled and said yes. And that felt like a victory. I asked Martha to take my picture at the library the next week. Nothing fancy, just me by the window, holding a stack of books. She laughed. You've never asked for that before. I just want to make sure I exist somewhere, I said. The photo turned out simple. Sunlight in my hair, smile small but real. When I looked at it, I thought, that's her. That's the woman I became when no one was watching. I framed it and placed it on my bedside table, not as proof, but as a promise. That night, I took the old watch from the drawer. It had stopped weeks ago. I wound it once, gently. The second hand ticked, slow, steady, alive. I wore it to bed, the ticking faint against my wrist. Each beat whispered something I'd forgotten. You're still here. Months later, David called. His voice sounded different, softer, almost unsure. I heard you're doing okay. I am. I wanted to say, I don't know, sorry, maybe. For what? Everything. You'll have to be more specific. He laughed quietly. You sound lighter. I am, I said. I hope you're happy, Helen. I'm learning how. And for the first time in our lives, there was nothing left to take or defend. Just silence, but a gentle kind this time. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Bills still came. Rain still leaked through the ceiling sometimes. Loneliness still visited, uninvited but familiar. But peace isn't the absence of struggle, it's the decision not to live inside it. I wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. Not for apologies, not for love, not for ghosts. I was simply present. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance my father could never give me. The right to belong to myself. One night, I stood by the window, the moonlight falling across the table where my journal lay open. The last line I wrote was simple. He left me nothing, so I learned to make something out of nothing. I closed the book, turned off the light, and let the darkness hold me, not as a punishment, but as proof that I was finally unafraid of it. Fade to silence.